Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to dig into the Dust Bowl.
Oh, the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, the 1930s.
Oh, good.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
We've got some really incredible audio from back in the day as a primary source to work with. And
Oh, wow.
I think listeners are going to get a lot out of this one. You know, like, how did this ecological disaster actually happen? And I think there are even some really unexpected connections back to World War I.
It's amazing how these things you think are totally separate can actually be linked like that.
Yeah, totally. So to get started, we have to go back even further to the idea of manifest destiny. I mean, it was this belief that America was destined to expand westward, and it really shaped the late 1800s.
And it led to things like the Homestead Act of 1862, right? That offered 160 acres of free land to anyone who was willing to go out there and cultivate it. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal on the surface, but...
Yeah, what's the catch?
Well, 160 acres, it sounds like a lot, but it wasn't really enough to support a family on the Great Plains. The soil and the climate were so different from back east, and get this, government surveyors actually warned about this. They said the land wasn't suitable for, widespread agriculture.
So why did people keep going west then?
I mean, think about it. There was this massive push for westward expansion, right? Fueled by manifest destiny plus free land is a pretty powerful incentive, especially if you're struggling back east.
It's like they couldn't see the warning signs, or maybe they just chose to ignore them.
Yeah, maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
Plus, there was a lot of hype, even outright fraud. Our source actually mentions this town called Boise City in the Oklahoma Panhandle, and it turned out to be a total scam.
What?
Yeah, developers were selling this dream of lush fields and a bustling town center, but when the settlers got there, all they found was a single concrete building and miles of dry prairie.
Oh, man, that's just heartbreaking. What happened to those people?
Well, some of them gave up and left, but others incredibly chose to stay and try to make a life for themselves. It's kind of amazing, shows their resilience and determination.
Wow, yeah, for sure. It's incredible how adaptable people can be even when things are so tough. But then, as if things weren't already hard enough, World War I breaks out in Europe.
And that really changed everything for American farmers. Suddenly there's this massive demand for wheat to feed all the troops overseas.
Right.
So the U.S. government steps in and guarantees farmers a price of $2 a bushel for their wheat.
Wow, that's
more than double the normal price.
So that must have been a huge incentive to plant even more wheat.
Absolutely. Farmers were rushing to convert even more grassland into farmland. And to make that possible, there was another big change happening at the same time, the rise of mechanized farming.
Like tractors and combines.
Exactly. Those new machines allowed farmers to cultivate these huge areas with way less labor. It was a technological revolution, but it also had some unintended consequences.
Our source mentions a farmer named Fred Folkers in Oklahoma. He seemed to really struggle to adapt to this new technology. Even his wife missed their old horse.
Yeah, it's a great example of that tension between the traditional ways of farming and this allure of progress. And it shows just how quickly the whole landscape of farming was changing on the Great Plains.
Yeah, it's a huge shift. And these changes, they kept coming even after the war ended. The government passed the Wheat Price Guarantee Act of 1920, hoping to prevent a post-war depression. So wheat prices stayed high, and this new type of farmer emerged. Suitcase farmer. Ah, yes. The suitcase farmers. Mostly investors, not your traditional farmers. They'd swoop in, buy or rent some land, plant their wheat, and then disappear until harvest time.
Yeah.
They were just looking for quick profits. They didn't have much connection to the land or the people who actually lived there.
Yeah, there's this scene in our source where a suitcase farmer checks into the Crystal Hotel in Boise City, and the hotel clerk gives him this look.
Oh, really?
This look of disapproval. You can almost feel the tension between the locals and these out-of-towners. That's really interesting. It speaks to this growing resentment towards these absentee farmers. They were profiting from a system that a lot of locals felt was just not sustainable.
Yeah, for sure. And then, of course, goes the crash. The stock market crash of 1929.
Yeah, that crash. It sent shockwaves through the entire economy. And agriculture was hit especially hard. Wheat prices plummeted, leaving so many farmers in debt.
So what did they do?
A lot of them felt like they had no choice but to just double down on wheat production, hoping to make up for the revenue they lost. It was a desperate gamble.
And the suitcase farmers.
Many of them just abandoned their land, leaving these vast fields bare and vulnerable to the elements.
So now you have these huge areas of land stripped of their protective grasses.
Yeah.
Farmers are struggling to just stay afloat. And then...
On September 14, 1930, the first major dust storm hit the Texas Panhandle.
It must have been terrifying.
Our source describes a woman making a frantic phone call to the Weather Bureau, desperate for information, but no one, not even the experts, understood what was happening.
It sounds like the beginning of a nightmare.
Mm.
What did this first dust storm actually look like?
Imagine a massive black cloud rolling across the plains, blotting out the sun, turning day into night. It was unlike anything people had ever seen before.
And that's where our audio source leaves us hanging for now. A family huddled together in their farmhouse as this ominous black cloud engulfs their home. It really sets the stage for the devastation that's about to unfold.
Sadly, that first dust storm wasn't just a one-time thing.
Well,
As the depression got worse and the drought just gripped the region, those storms, they became more frequent and way more
it's
intense.
like all these different factors were building and building until
Yeah.
finally
Yeah.
something had to give.
Exactly. The topsoil wasn't anchored by those native grasses anymore, so it was just picked up by the wind,
Right.
and there was nothing to stop it. The
Yeah.
dust traveled for hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles.
Our source talks about these storms as being biblical in scale, almost apocalyptic.
People started calling them black blizzards. I mean, can you imagine that? A wall of dust, thousands of feet high, blocking out the sun, turning day into night. The dust, it got into everything. Homes, lungs, even the food. It must have been suffocating and terrifying.
I can't even imagine. And the impact on people's health must have been just devastating.
It was. People were dying from something called dust pneumonia, basically a respiratory illness caused by breathing in all those fine particles.
Wow.
Children were especially vulnerable.
So it wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was a human tragedy, too. Families were forced to abandon their farms, their homes, their livelihoods. They basically became refugees in their own country.
You got it. They packed whatever they could into their cars and headed west, hoping for a better life in California. It's a whole other chapter of the Dust Bowl story.
Right. It's a powerful reminder that the Dust Bowl wasn't just about dust storms. It was about humans suffering on a massive scale. What's really striking to me is how this combination of factors led to the disaster. We're talking about manifest destiny and those government policies that encouraged westward expansion.
Right. Those policies definitely played a role. They incentivized turning grasslands into farmland, even when experts were warning against it. Short-term gain leading to these massive long-term consequences.
Yeah, then you have the wartime demand for wheat that really accelerated the whole process, plus that new farming technology that made it possible to farm these huge areas.
And don't forget the government. They kept encouraging wheat production even after the war was over, with things like the Wheat Price Guarantee Act. It's almost like they were trying to keep an unsustainable system going even when all the signs were pointing in the other direction.
And then there's the human element, too. The suitcase farmers. Driven by profit, they just exploited the land and didn't seem to care much about the consequences.
And even some of the local farmers, in their desperation to survive the Depression, they made choices that ultimately made the whole situation worse.
It's such a complex story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Government policies, economic forces, human choices, a lack of understanding of how delicate the ecological balance of the Great Plains was. It all came together.
And it really shows what can happen when we ignore nature's limits.
Right. It also makes you think about that idea that was so popular back then, rain follows the plow. This belief that cultivating the land would actually bring more rain.
Oh, yeah. That's fascinating. A flawed theory with real-world consequences. That idea really took hold in the late 1800s. Maybe because there were a few wet years that happened to coincide with increased farming.
So it's like they saw a connection that wasn't really there.
Exactly. But the Dust Bowl proved that theory was totally wrong. Plowing up the grasslands actually made the drought worse because it exposed the soil to more evaporation.
It's just tragic. So why should we care about the Dust Bowl all these years later?
Well, for one thing, it's a cautionary tale about unsustainable land management. Those lessons are still relevant today. I mean, we're facing challenges like climate change and trying to balance economic development with protecting the environment.
Yeah, we're still grappling with those issues.
The Dust Bowl shows what can happen when we put short-term gains ahead of long-term sustainability. And it reminds us that we have to be more aware of how our actions impact the environment.
The human side of the story is so important, too. These stories of resilience and adaptation and the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship.
Yeah, the Dust Bowl migrants who had to leave their homes, their stories are incredible. They showed so much courage and resourcefulness. Their experiences really shaped the American West.
It's a reminder that history is about more than just dates and events. It's about people and their stories, both their struggles and their triumphs.
Their stories can inspire us to face the challenges we're dealing with now with that same determination and hope.
Right. Our source ends with a thought-provoking question.
Does it?
Yeah.
What is it?
If the Dust Bowl was a man-made disaster, could something like it happen again? Maybe a different form.
It's a chilling question, but it's an important one to ask. The Dust Bowl was unique, but those underlying factors, unsustainable practices, economic pressures, ignoring environmental limits, those are all still with us today.
So we've been talking about the Dust Bowl and what an impact it had on American history. We've seen how government policies and economic forces, even some flawed theories, played a part. And we've touched on the human side, too. Choices, resilience, and sometimes just plain short-sightedness.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking, huh? Can we take what we've learned from the Dust Bowl and use it to deal with the challenges we're facing today? I mean, is that even possible?
Right. That's the big question. It's like a warning from history. How do we use what we know to build a future that's sustainable, especially with all these new threats on the horizon?
One thing that really stands out from the Dust Bowl is how important it is to understand the connection between what we do and these natural systems.
Hmm.
The settlers on the Great Plains, they just didn't get how fragile that ecosystem was.
They probably looked at all that land and thought it was limitless.
Yeah, I think so. And we see that kind of thinking today too, don't we? With deforestation, overfishing, using up all our natural resources.
It's like we haven't really learned that lesson yet.
The Dust Bowl also shows how important it is to think about the long term when we're making policies. The Homestead Act and those wheat price guarantees, they were supposed to help people, but they didn't take into account the impact it would have on the environment.
And that impact was huge. It took decades for the Great Plains to recover.
We need policies that encourage doing things in a sustainable way, not just for the short-term economic gain. And that takes a real shift in mindset for individuals and for society as a whole.
So what can we actually do? What actions can we take to avoid making the same mistakes?
Well, supporting policies that promote things like soil conservation and sustainable agriculture is a good place to start. We got to figure out how to produce food without destroying the land.
We've come a long way with sustainable farming since the Dust Bowl, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. We also have to look at how climate change is affecting our environment. The Dust Bowl was made worse by the drought, and climate change is making extreme weather events more and more common.
So it's not just about preserving the land. It's about tackling climate change itself.
Exactly. And that's going to take everyone working together, reducing emissions, switching to renewable energy, and investing in infrastructure that can actually handle the impacts of climate change.
Sometimes it all feels so overwhelming.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
But it's also empowering to realize that we do have the knowledge and the tools to make a difference. We don't have to just stand by and watch things happen.
That's so true. It reminds me of something else we learned from the Dust Bowl, that resilience of the human spirit. Even when they were facing incredible hardships, people found ways to adapt, to rebuild, to create a new future.
Yeah, the Dust Bowl migrants who had to leave their homes, their stories are so powerful. They really show what human courage and resourcefulness look like, and they had a huge impact on the American West.
It's a good reminder that even when things seem really dark, there's always hope. And we have a responsibility to honor those who came before us by creating a world that's both sustainable and just.
I love that way. Well, this deep dive has been quite a journey, hasn't it? From manifest destiny to that first dust storm, from economic collapse to human resilience, the Dust Bowl gives us so much to think about.
It definitely does. It leaves us with some big questions, too. How do we balance our need to grow economically with the need to protect the planet? How can we make sure what we do today doesn't create new dust bowls for future generations?
Those are important questions to consider. The choices we make individually and as a society will determine what kind of future we create. Let's learn from the past, face the challenges in front of us, and work together to build a better, more sustainable world.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Dust Bowl. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.
And don't forget, never underestimate the power of human ingenuity and compassion to create a better tomorrow.